The Broadcasting Service of the University of Iowa and the Department of English at the university present Literary Topics. Tonight, Professor Robert Scholes talks with Kurt Vonnegut Jr. about the writings of fiction and about Vonnegut's career as a writer. Their conversation was recorded in 1966 during Vonnegut's time at Iowa as a member of the faculty of the Writers' Workshop. Here is Professor Robert Scholes.
Kurt Vonnegut Jr. teaches in the Writers' Workshop here at the university and is the author of 5 novels and any number of short stories, book reviews, and other kinds of writing. We're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Vonnegut's work, about this thing called black humor, and about other things that may come up as we start talking about his own work and his experiences. Kurt, to begin with, I'm curious myself about how you got involved in this business of writing. Did you always mean to be a writer?
No, I think it was the only out for me. I had a very disagreeable job at General Electric, and this was an out.
Are there agreeable jobs at General Electric?
Yes, I think there are. I think president of General Electric is a very agreeable job, and also chairman of the board.
Yeah, the rest of them, though, are more or less disagreeable.
Well, I was quite low on the rungs of advancement there, and I started selling stories to Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post, and was very happy to leave rather than to get to the top the hard way.
Yeah, I suppose then you were not a product of a creative writing school or program yourself.
I didn't know they existed at that time. I went to an excellent high school which encouraged creative writing, which was Shortridge High School in Indianapolis.
You grew up in Indianapolis?
Yes.
And what happened in between high school and General I want to say General Motors, but...
Same thing. Makes no difference.
I get all these corporations mixed up.
No, it's after high school, my father suggested that I become a scientist. My father himself was an architect and quite demoralized about the arts, as he hadn't made any money for 10 years because of the Depression. So he told me to be a chemist, and since it was his money, I went and started to become a chemist at Cornell University. And the war came along, thank God, in the middle of my junior year, and I left most gratefully for the infantry. This is actually a career of a quitter. I have quit and quit and quit.
I'm afraid a lot of careers take that same pattern, but fortunately we're interviewing you here today. You started out to be a chemical engineer. Does that account, do you think, for the interest in technology that seems to run through your work?
Well, it accounts for my familiarity with technology somewhat, and through what seemed misfortunes to me at the time, I have learned something about physics, chemistry, and math, and the sorts of people who are successful in those areas. So I have been able to take off on them with a fair amount of expertness. After the war, I went to the University of Chicago and studied anthropology for 3 years, and then went to work for General Electric as a public relations man. And because of all this background in science that I had, they made me a publicity man for the research laboratory there, which is an excellent industrial research laboratory.
I see.
So I saw these people at work and knew them quite well and went to their parties and so forth, and proceeded to hurt their feelings in my first book, which was
Player
about
Piano.
them, yes.
Yes, I've wondered about Player Piano. In particular, one of the things that interested me was this great summer festival that the technicians hold somewhere up in the North Woods. I wondered if there's a real background to that.
Yes, there is. It was called Association Island, and it was owned by the, let's see, what was it? There was some association of electric light manufacturers in the early days of the electrical industry, and they were friendly competitors, and they met to discuss business on this island once a year, and this became sort of a Boy Scout festival. What the competitors did not know for quite a while was that they were all owned by General Electric, and the competition, no matter what happened to the competition, General Electric won.
Marvelous.
But this became, in later years, a morale-building operation for General Electric, and deserving young men were sent up there for a week and played golf, and there were archery contests and baseball contests and swimming contests and plenty of free liquor and so forth.
So the bizarre events in Player Piano are pretty realistic after all, are they?
Well, Player Piano, when it came out, was not a widely read book except in Schenectady, New York, and the island was shut down after the book came
No
out.
kidding.
It no longer exists.
I'll tell you something I heard last summer that may interest you. I was talking to someone going out to the West Coast who had just been at a session out in the northern part of California, which reminded me very much of the episode in Player Piano. Apparently, some large organization out there invites up-and-coming young men in all professions, and old men too, so that you find admirals and generals and businessmen and whatnot, and they seem to go through a ritual quite like the ritual described in Player Piano.
Yes, it's found to work. It's a cheesy little religion which is satisfactory for a week or so, and
Some last long and some
yes,
last a little
is most
while.
husbands coming back from one of these things won't tell their wives what happened there. You know, is because it's so silly.
Yeah, not because they do anything really wrong. just
No,
because
oh no, it's a very clean operation.
The Boy Scout atmosphere sounds very strong in it.
I think the book would have sold a great deal better if I had intimated that there were party girls flown in and so forth, but there are not.
You may not be realistic, but you have your standards, I suppose. There, which brings me to another point. I'm very interested in how you came to write the kind of stories that you started writing and still write, which have some connections with science fiction and generally seem more fantastic in some ways than the orthodox kind of writing. How did it happen that you wrote that sort of stuff?
I suppose I admired H.G. Wells a lot, and Mark Twain and so forth, and somehow got those wires crossed. And at Cornell, when I was studying chemistry, what I was really doing most of the time was writing for the Cornell Daily Sun, which you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I became managing editor of the Sun, and I wrote about 3 columns a week, and they were impudent editorializing, is college humor sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I continue to editorialize it. That was congenial, and so I've always had to have an axe to grind in order to write.
Was the Sun then a commercial enterprise as it is now?
Yes, it was always independent of the university. It was a separate corporation, and the prospect was, in my day, that the managing editor and the editor-in-chief and the advertising director would all split some sort of financial melon at the end of the year. And in my day, that came to about $1,000. But World War II destroyed our melon, as that the Sun slowly died for lack of staff.
Well, it was going strong when I was back at Cornell in the late 50s, and there was a melon again to be split,
Yes.
I think.
How much, do you know?
I haven't any idea.
Yeah, it's probably about $3,000 or $4,000 now.
I would think so, but probably not worth any more than the 1,000 of back then. But it says something about free enterprise, I think, that the newspaper should be good because there's a melon to be split.
Yes, well, ever so often, of course, a professor at Cornell would threaten to have an editor of the Sun fired for some piece of impudence, and he would discover that the Sun had no connection with the university, and that the man he was threatening to fire was in fact the chief executive of a separate corporation.
Which is a lovely thing. It should be encouraged in other places, I think. Well, one of the labels that gets pasted on your work a lot is this term black humor, which seems to get applied to nearly everybody who writes nowadays at one moment or another. I wonder whether someone like yourself objects to it, or whether you more or less accept it as a description of what you do.
Well, I find it mystifying. What it seems to be is a sales promotion label. It's as though someone took a great bell jar and caught a certain number of crickets under it, and gave a name to all those crickets, because, and this is, Bruce J. Friedman?
That book of his is the first place I saw the
called
term.
Black Humor, and in that with Terry Southern, Barth, who else?
Celine, I think. Albee is even in that book. Donlevy.
Yes, well, Friedman, in a way, Friedman, who's a very young man, became sort of the grandfather of all the black humorists by being editor-in-chief of a book called Black Humor.
I looked him up the other day someplace. He's about 34 years old, or 33, I think. He's very young.
No, but anything that gets people interested in books is good for all authors. So I can't really complain about this. If people are talking about books and they want to talk about black humor as the latest thing, that's fine. At
As
least
long
they're
as it isn't maybe just a fashion which will
Yes.
change in another year or two, and all those
Yeah.
old crickets will have to be swept out and new ones caught.
Well, the expert we ought to have here is David Heyman, I think, who is, the resident expert on humor, isn't he?
He's working now on a book on the clown in European literature, which will be very interesting, I think, when he gets it done.
Yes, but as a specialist, why, he becomes very outraged about black humor because he feels that this is a continuous development going back, I don't know how many years. He's probably pushed it back 600 or 700 years by now.
Well, I think it probably goes back to Aristophanes, who seems to me to
Yes.
have a lot of the same instincts that you do, though he never worked for General Mills or General Electric or whatever.
I read Aristophanes when I was 14, and liked it very much, and of course read it as 14-year-olds do, because I was told it was dirty, and it certainly was. So it was great. I won twice. You know, it was not only dirty, it was good.
Right. Well, the marvelous thing about Aristophanes is that he is funny, and he's still funny. The jokes still work somehow. They may be dirty jokes, some of them, but they are jokes, whereas some of the current dirty literature isn't even funny.
No, not comical in the least. As the corners of your mouth pull down as you're reading it. There are not carefully rigged gags in there as there are in Aristophanes.
Aristophanes reminds me of this thing that I just saw this afternoon, the long, really very long essay on your work in the New Republic, in which the essayist, after praising you for any number of things, complains a little bit at the end that you aren't bitter enough, not enough of a satirist. I wonder how you feel about that yourself. Are you trying to write satire and failing?
Well, he says I am, and he would be a better judge of that than I would. An outsider would be. As my wife is a better judge of what I'm doing than I am, and this man in the Brian in the New Republic feels I should be more savage, and what he offers as an example, the fact that I was a prisoner of war and saw the bombing of Dresden, which was a man-made disaster of the very first order in European history. It was the largest massacre in European history, and he feels I should be enraged by this, and that the rage should show. You mentioned Aristophanes. He's surely not an angry satirist.
No, he isn't, and this is what one likes about him, I think. When you think of the really angry satirists, well, you think of Swift, I suppose. And one of the prices Swift pays for his anger is his insanity, I guess. And
Yes.
that, in a way, detracts from the quality of the work, I think. It provides for the bite, but it also makes you back off a little bit from Swift and say somehow it isn't that bad.
Yes.
You know, it's plenty bad, but it isn't that bad.
Yes, well, I find, Ambrose Bierce is another example of a man who spills over into actual hatred for mankind.
Right, I think Twain does too. At the
As an
very
old
end,
man,
yeah.
yes. Yes, he does. And I find Norman Mailer frightening that way. Of course, he never means to be comical, or I suppose he does mean to be comical, but ever so often this really almost Gestapo hatred for mankind shows through.
Right.
The murderousness, in which
Right.
case the reader is right to draw back.
Well, I'm sure that the reviewer in New Republic wouldn't really want to prefer Twain's late works to the early works that most of us, common and uncommon readers, seem to admire.
Well, the very late works is Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven, and
Right. Pudd'nhead Wilson, I guess, is fairly late.
yeah. Well, actually, he's closer to the frontier. Toward the end, it seems to me, is the very primitive sort of humor of the frontier when he's an old man than he was as a young man.
I guess when he was out west, he looked toward Hartford, and when he got to Hartford, he turned around and looked back.
Has somebody said that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Now they have.
Yeah. Well, I remember he started this fragmentary book on etiquette, And I guess it was one of the articles was how to behave at a funeral, and the very last line is, "Do not bring your dog."
Well, that's charming. That's not angry at all.
No,
That's
no,
that's
it's
a great
mordant,
thing.
I think. Isn't mordant the right word?
Yeah, black humor, I suppose, is what we
Yeah, that's plenty black.
come around to, but also humorous. It seems to me if this term black humor has any validity, it must be pointing at something a little different from satire.
Well, something that's bothered me about the current black humor, is some of it, is that the author seems to regard it as shameful that human beings excrete and have sex lives, is marked people for their bodily functions.
I
And
think Swift had a strong streak of that in him,
Yes.
too.
But that's a sad place to begin, is that we can do nothing about.
Right, right. Except brood, I suppose, and Swift did a share of brooding. There are writers who seem to find it very amusing that human beings have all the plumbing equipment they have, but don't seem disturbed by it. I should think Rabelais would be of that kind, and maybe Aristophanes himself would find it amusing that we have at the same time high ideals and all this plumbing
Yes,
that
and
you can't
most
turn
of-
off.
Yeah, and most of our money spent on getting rid of unsightly waste.
Right, right.
Yes, and body odors. No, it would be very nice to have Aristophanes or Rabelais around. I think two humane men with some sort of utopia in mind. Each of them had a utopia. And
Right.
Swift, of course, wanted the horses to take over. And Clarence Day, I guess, wanted the cats to take over.
I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Yes, as Clarence Day wrote a thing called This Simian World.
I've heard the
And,
title. I know him,
yeah.
of course, as the Life with the Father.
Yeah, well,
man.
Clarence Day, incidentally, I think Thurber talks about him. Thurber talks about the tragic roots of humor, and Thurber, I think, somewhere says that a comedian is from a sad home, and that a humorist is from a tragic home. And Clarence Day's father evidently was a truly savage man who scared little Clarence to death.
Wow,
And
well,
out of this came this very funny play about a childhood that was not in the least funny.
So that the play was not a reflection, not a direct reflection of the home life, but a kind of defense against
Yes.
the actual home,
Yeah.
I suppose. Gosh, let me ask you another question. We said a while back that you got interested in science because of your early training in it. What about science fiction as a way of doing literature, as opposed to black humor? You've been called both things, I suppose, a science fiction writer and a black humorist. Are you a science fiction writer?
Well, I wrote a thing in the New York Times last year about this, is objecting finally, because I thought it was costing me a lot of money and reputation, because most people regard science fiction writers as interchangeable with comic book writers, as they frequently are.
They frequently are, but there have been some pretty astonishing things.
Extraordinary work, yes, and all writers are going to have to learn more about science, simply because it's such an important part of their environment. It's something that worries me about some of our students in the workshop, is they know nothing about machinery, about the scientific method and so forth. And to reflect their times accurately, to respond to their times reasonably, they have to understand that part of their environment.
You begin to sound like C.P. Snow and the two
Yes,
cultures.
well,
Do you agree
well,
with
C.P. Snow and I are both very smug on the subject of two cultures, because we both have two cultures,
You know
see.
some science and you write some
Yes,
literature.
Yes.
Yeah, well, H.G. Wells, I guess, was the granddaddy of you and C.P. Snow in a way. I assume Snow admired Wells and read him fairly early in the
Well,
game.
I'm sure every Englishman did, and Wells is much admired in England still, I believe. Very good stories that Wells wrote. And he started out as a chemist, I believe, very briefly, and gave it up. And as did H.L. Mencken, incidentally. He started out as a chemist.
No, that's one I didn't
Yeah.
didn't know. He really went to
Yeah.
the other extreme,
Yeah.
didn't he? Yeah, I've read a little bit of Wells recently, some old short stories, things that came out in the Yellow Book of all places. You think
Oh.
of the Yellow Book as full of aesthetes and Aubrey Beardsley's. Wells appeared in it also with a little science story about some science students. And he had a real gift for writing, even in a casual piece like that, I think.
Yes, well, he wasn't a bad prophet either, and it's helpful to have prophets.
Right.
It would be helpful to have politicians who would listen to them, too.
Well, then you wouldn't write Cat's Cradle, would you, if the prophets and the politicians listened to one another?
No, I'm giving a seminar, and I'm not quite sure what it is. Every week we discuss something now, and one subject I want to discuss is what books do politicians read, so that all these would-be writers can find out that nobody of any importance is ever going to pay any attention to them.
Would be a good thing, because it seems to me a lot of writers, a lot of American writers right now are trying in one way or another to get closer to politics than maybe a writer can or should get to it. I think Mailer has tried this. Mark Harris seems to be fluttering around politics considerably also with that. And did you read that Nixon book of his?
No.
Mark the Glove Boy was the name of it, and most of it was a fantasy about assassinating Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
Curious thing for a writer to be doing, which reminds me that a number of these people who get called black humorists seem mainly to be fantasists, to be imagining things that they either fear or like, and just writing down what they imagine. Terry Southern seems to me as kind of pure wish fulfillment writer very often, or fear fulfillment writer.
Yes, I think maybe wish fulfillment. On Candy, of course, he was paid to do it as pornography.
Right, I
In
was thinking of The
Paris,
Magic Christian. Have you?
Yeah. No, I read part of The Magic Christian that appeared in Esquire, I think.
This is one sequence after another of a very rich man embarrassing and humiliating people, people usually who deserve it for one reason or another.
Yeah.
But this isn't satire either, and it isn't exactly the kind of comic thing that you do. It is sort of getting even in writing.
Yes, well, in the same issue, the New Republic here, there's a review of Friedman's work by Kaufman, and
Bruce J. Friedman?
yeah, Bruce Friedman and Stanley Kaufman, right?
Right.
And in there, he says exactly what you said. Kaufman does, that Friedman is using his creations as objects to keep his fear at bay and the reader's fear at bay.
Does he write about what, Mother Night and Stern, or is there a new?
He writes. I don't
mean
Friedman,
Mother Night. I mean
Friedman
Kisses.
has just brought out a collection of 10 short stories. One of which is that Brazzaville Teenager. Did you happen to see that?
No.
Well, it's awfully hard to explain. But the Friedman, incidentally, makes you laugh, which most of the black humorists do not.
He certainly does. A Mother's Kisses, frightening as it is in its way, is a very funny book. And though that mother seems a little bit too grand to be true, there's also a touch of many mothers in her, I think. I think there's a fair amount of laughter in a lot of writers that often get treated as if they were trying to be satirists, as if they were trying to reform the world, when really they're not trying to do that at all, but trying to make some sort of comic structure out of things which can be pretty bad.
Yes, well, that's a rewarding thing to do, to make someone laugh, and I have tried to do it, and felt it was sort of an imperative that anything I wrote had to make someone laugh, or it was a failure. And I think part of this comes from the fact that I was the youngest kid in my family by far. And I think this is true of stand-up comedians, customarily, that they are the youngest child, or among the youngest in a huge family. And it is the most satisfactory way to get attention. You don't get punished for it.
You get turned into a fool or a clown or something by
and you
circumstances.
get better at it, and
Naturally.
it's a thing that can be done very well.
And I suppose fools are partly born and partly made, then
Yes.
you can practice it. It seems to me to be a very good and real thing, laughter, and I haven't got much faith myself in satire ever reforming anybody or making them better or changing the world. Laughter doesn't pretend to do that. It just does a little immediate good, I suppose.
Well, I've worried some about why write books? Why are we teaching people to write books? And presidents and senators do not read them, and generals do not read them. And it's been the university experience that's taught me that there is a very good reason that you catch people before they become generals and presidents and so forth, and you poison their minds with humanity and however you want to poison their minds is presumably to encourage them to make a better world.
Right. I'm delighted that you use that expression, poison their minds, because I spent part of this summer reading and rereading some of your books and writing an essay of my own about them. And as I was reading them and thinking about them and working on this essay, it came to me that one of the real services that your kind of writing does is very much like what A.E. Housman, who's a sort of black humorist in poetry, talks about in a poem of his called Terence, This is Stupid Stuff. And he cites the ancient king Mithridates, who trained himself by taking poison in small doses to resist the stuff when it really came at him. It seems to me that black humor, if it is anything, is small, manageable doses of poison, neatly packaged, and the comedy making it palatable that helps us to get through the terrible things in the world.
Well, it would be nice if it worked. There was a friendly review of two of my books. It was in Harper's last spring. It's by a guy named Richard Schickel, who was a stranger, word of honor, at the time he wrote it, and I've since gotten to know him. But one of the things he said was that I had found in laughter an analgesic for the temporary relief of existential pain. And this may not be true. I wish it were true. It's a very
I hadn't
very
seen
nice sentence.
Schickel's thing, but I was struck the same way by your things. In fact, I got to thinking about this existential business and Camus and the myth of Sisyphus and all of these things. And it seemed to me that the French go on and on so about bearing things, but they never give you much in their works to make things more bearable.
No. I was thinking about the Depression. This was a great time for comedians, the radio comedian, and a very bad time in the history of the country, far more unbearable in the First or Second World Wars, I think, as it ground
Back
people.
on the home front, I should imagine.
Yes, the Depression did break people's spirits. And the comedians who, there was one each day at least, is Fred Allen, Joe Penner, Jack Benny, and so forth. You got your little dose of humor every day, and people did cluster around radios to pick up that amount of encouragement, that amount of relief.
Oh, I was born in 1929 myself, but I can remember waiting for Sunday nights when you used to get Benny and Allen.
Yes.
Both.
And then finally Henry Morgan. It was Benny Allen and then Henry Morgan.
It was quite an evening. It made you get through the week all right.
Well, I got a letter from Morgan. I don't know him, but we did have a brief interchange of letters. And I told him I remembered a joke of his from, must have been about 1936, which was that Morgan says, well, you know that cat that inherited $5 million last year? Well, he died. Left his money to another cat. And that helped, you know. I got everybody through 3 more days of depression. And
it's so wonderful. It's so wonderful. It just takes what really happens, people leaving their monies to cats, and pushes it.
Yeah. It's somehow television isn't able to, well, they haven't done much funny stuff, I guess. But back in the days of radio, gags were treasured, as they were remembered and told the next day and for the next few days.
I can remember things from Fibber McGee and Molly that still stay with me. They must be about that same vintage also.
Yeah.
I remember a great episode, the Fibber McGee and Molly's, and it's sort of a real depression episode. Fibber gets the idea that he's going to make money by cashing in on this soup company that has a deal where if you don't like their soup, you get double your money back. And he buys an enormous number of boxes of cans of this soup. And finally, being an honest man, he decides that he will taste it before he cashes in on all of the cans. He doesn't heat it or anything. He's not that honest, but he does decide he'll open a can and taste it. I remember very well the moment Molly was around watching him, and there was a sort of hush, and he tasted it, and he said, "Why, it's delicious."
Yeah.
And
Is-
there he was.
Yeah. Of course, another way to play the Depression or any tragedy is to play it straight, and for its beauty is to find some beauty in the tragedy of it. And Verlin Castle has certainly done that in many of his short stories.
Story like The Father.
Yes, he's not going to laugh at it. He's going to look at it the way it really was, and it comes out a perfectly gorgeous thing in the hands of a right man. It did in Verlin's case.
Right.
Most humorists don't dare do it.
Now, in both cases, though, it's sort of finding a pattern, finding a shape, and some sort of meaning in the business instead of just seeing it as aimless, I guess, isn't it?
Yes, yes, but finishing one of Verlin's stories about the Depression is you get your catharsis through a groan. I think you really have to groan. As when I read The Father, The Father, I groaned. It was and the same relief as a laugh, I'm sure. The results are, I don't think the body cares which you do really, but you must do one or the other.
The muscles probably have
Yeah.
the final answer in these things. Well, there's some news that we got this fall about your work that I think other people will be interested in. I remember hearing from you late in the summer that your novel Cat's Cradle was going to be made into a musical comedy, which startled me a bit. Did it startle you, or had you always expected this to happen?
No, I never expected anything good to happen. I never expected a university to hire me. I thought I was going to starve to death. I didn't think Cat's Cradle could be made into a musical because musical is built around usually a very short period of time and one or two simple ideas. And Cat's Cradle ranges over many years and involves part of the industrial history of the United States, and it requires a certain amount of scientific sophistication to appreciate. There just seemed to be too much information to process.
Right.
And so I condensed, so when this Hillard Elkins, who produced Golden Boy with Sammy Davis Jr., asked me to turn it into a musical. He optioned the thing. And so I dutifully, without consulting with him, condensed the thing, just cut it way down. And he came up to my home on Cape Cod and said, no, it's just do it straight, put everything in it you want to put in it, and don't worry about it. Let me worry about it.
You were trying to get the dramatic unities in there.
I was trying to save him money. I wanted this show to go on, see? And because I get paid as people come through the turnstile. You see, it's pretty much speculation until the curtain actually goes up. But he had been thinking about it a great deal, and in order to process a heck of a lot of information in a hurry to provide quick windows into the past, we're going to use film along with actors and dancers and so forth.
Has this been tried much, do you know, on the stage?
Well, there have been all sorts of trick things done with projecting images on a scrim, you know, as rooftops and there was one very fancy production of Major Barbara, which had stunning visual effects, you know, gardens that would go off into the distance many miles apparently. And there's one technique that they've experimented with, which I think involves a beaded curtain and motion picture cameras, where an actor can go up to the top of a real fire escape and disappear behind the beaded curtains as his image appears on the beaded curtains projected there, and he jumps off the fire escape and crashes on the ground, that sort of thing, you know. But I think this is disturbing to audiences, I think. They think too much about technique, and I think we're going to possibly use just lantern slides, as people are used to lantern slides, you know, and wham, we'll shoot a picture of a scene 30 years ago and leave it up there for about 2 seconds and then get back to the actors.
There'll be something going on at the stage all the time. Well, this sounds a little bit like happening technique.
Yes,
where you
sure.
have different things.
It's very McLuhan. It's very in, and I'm sure it'll be terribly expensive.
Yeah.
is this Elkins came up to see me on the Cape, and I have a son who skydives. He's 16 years old.
Parachutes?
Yes.
Wow.
And he's made 5 jumps, and so Elkins, who looks like a very tough guy, I asked Elkins, what, do you skydive, Hilly? And he said, no, I bring musicals into New York City for $750,000.
Yeah, skydiving sounds easy by comparison. You know, I read somewhere that Tennessee Williams thought of having a movie sequence in the Glass Menagerie. It's in the first
Well, it is in
version
the
of that.
script. I didn't know about the movie part. I know that he projected lines on the wall of where someone would say a particularly poignant line. A lantern slide would wham, shoot that line up on the wall, and it would hang there through the next few lines.
And that's not one that I heard. I heard that he had a sort of flashback movie thing planned for the look back into the past that you get in that play. That business of hanging lines up there reminds me of a thing you were doing in the manuscript you read from here last year, where you were repeating the last words of paragraphs.
Yes.
Are you still playing around with that idea?
Well, I'm still playing around with it. I got a little embarrassed with it, though. It's such a mannered thing, and if you do it for a whole book, you get embarrassed. It's a terribly literary thing to do.
But maybe a chapter or two you could get away with it on. I was thinking you must be interested in these technical effects, printing effects and other things. I noticed Mr. Rosewater has a very unusual printing format in the margins.
Yes, well, that was a typographer's plaything. I explained to him that I wanted to be avant-garde and that he should do something on the order of Bauhaus, you know, which is what, 1922 is
that
avant-garde.
yeah.
And, of course, typographers don't get to play much, and so he really had himself a time. And I've heard poets complain about it because they try to read it as poetry, is what it is playing with the margins. And,
right, and it's not your playing, but the typographer.
It is, yes. Yeah,
playing.
he set that rhythm.
Yeah. The book of yours, it seems a little bit different from all the others, and I think perhaps my favorite of them all is Mother Night. It seems a little darker than the others, a little less comic, but by no means a satire. Do you feel that it stands out among your other works as being different from them, or is that just
Yes,
my
I think
vision?
it does. Well, it is more personally disturbing to me. It had meanings for me. Because of the war and because of my German background and that sort of thing. So sure, I did tend to get somewhat involved with that. Is at that time I needed money, and this came out as a paperback, as a gold medal paperback. In those days, if you had published something, you could go to a paperback house and give them one chapter and an outline, and they would give you money, which would pay your grocery bill anyway.
Yeah.
That was always the end of it, but there were times when you had to take it or leave it. And in the midst of writing that, I went to London, and we joined a private theater club and saw one play, which was The Caretaker. It was the first Pinter play, or the first one to come to this country, and the first to make any appreciable impression on England. And Lord, what a thing that was to see. Like no other play. And I didn't want to write a book anymore. You know, I wanted to be a playwright. I wanted to be Pinter. And so I was rather gloomy as I finished up the book.
Is that how your hero got to be a playwright in the book?
No, he was a playwright before I went to London. But
Not the sort of playwright that Pinter was.
No.
However,
gosh, I didn't know there could be a playwright like Pinter. That was so different.
A lot of these New English playwrights are interesting. Arnold Wesker is a pretty interesting playwright too.
Yes. While we were in London, we got an introduction to the cultural attaché at the American Embassy, who gave a party and invited C.P. Snow and his wife and Wesker.
Wow.
And I was the American cultural counterbalance there, you see. At that time, I think I published one book, but Sir Charles was very nice. And Wesker was an elf, came late and wore a sort of suede jerk, and he was, it's what the Seven Dwarfs and Snow
Well, he
White
died.
wore. Yeah.
And I suppose he's been very left since the beginning, practicing communist or the next thing.
I
to it.
suppose. He was complaining then about his fame because no money came with it, and he kept saying, "When's money going to come?"
That doesn't sound like a communistic sentiment.
Well, I think it does. In a capitalist society, I think a communist wants everything he can get.
That seems fair enough, really.
It's an interesting way of undermining a society, I think, is to take some of their money away.
I was interested, as I think the man who wrote this piece in the New Republic was, in the little prefatory note that you added to the new hardbound version of Mother Night about your sitting through the bombing of Dresden as a prisoner of war. I would agree with this man that is a particularly powerful piece of writing. Do you mean to do more with your own experiences in a literary way, or are you
Yes,
saving
I'm working on it now. It's what I've been working on for a long time, and it's extremely hard to think about. You have these enormous concentration camps, full of corpses, and then you have a city full of corpses, and is the city full of corpses right or wrong?
Yeah. Did you get into the mathematics of
Yes, I suppose that's what you
burning
have
people,
you have to do. Yeah.
Finally, there's so many different ways to do it. Napalm, incendiary bombing, gas chambers. How do you tell the good guys from the bad guys in a situation like this?
Well, I think the only thing I have been able to think of doing as a result of seeing the destruction of that city there and knowing at the same time about the great crimes of Germany is to become the impossible thing, which is a pacifist. I figure I'm under an obligation, having seen all this, that's the only possible conclusion I can come to, is that we must not fight under any conditions.
Well,
and let someone else hit the happy middle ground,
It seems to me the more one looks into these wars, the less they ever seem to prove or
Oh, that World War II was a good one, though. That was...
Well, that's the worst thing Hitler did, was to make war creditable again,
Yes.
to be a real bad guy.
Yes, and and we came out as the authentic good guys, and then on into the reconstruction of Europe, too. And it's made us very smug and prone to make ghastly mistakes because we have been virtuous.
Right. A little virtue is a dangerous thing, I
think
guess.
so.
Well, I guess we're about out of time. Thank you very much for coming
thank you,
and
Bob.
talking, Kurt.
Talking with Kurt Vonnegut Jr. was Professor Robert Scholes of the Department of English at the University of Iowa. Their conversation was recorded in 1966 during Vonnegut's time at Iowa as a member of the faculty of the Writers' Workshop. Our program continues with remarks to young writers made by Vonnegut during his appearance this past year at the university. In this recording, he is introduced by George Starbuck, director of the Writers' Workshop.